Welcome to Total Network Operations, the project with a podcast that's dedicated to hardworking network operators like you who deliver all the packets. Here on TNOps, we shine a bright light on great ideas in NetOps so you can make informed decisions for your network and your team. I'm your host, Scott Robon. Today, we have a sponsored episode with Ajay Chenampara, National Leader for Public Sector Automation Strategy, and Tony Dubiel, Principal Specialist Solution Architect, both of Red Hat. Ansible from Red Hat is a leader in helping customers herding their automations and putting them into production. Now, we're going to focus on public sector issues today, and that's very broadly defined. It means a lot to me because early in my career, my first job out of university was working for a U.S. government agency. Even though I didn't start out in networking as a primary role, I found myself working with the IT team, helping them with networking issues, making my first patch cables. And since then, I've worked with different public sector organizations and government clients over the decades. Ajay and Tony are focused on public sector organizations, and we're going to spend some time today talking about issues that those organizations run into in terms of operations, automation, and more. So, Ajay and Tony, it's great to have you here today on TNOps. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, about your history, and what you do at Red Hat. Tony, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I'm Tony Dubiel. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm a product solutions architect. So I'm focused on Ansible, and primarily my skill set is to be a lead for network automation. I started my career in the Air Force as a communications computer systems controller, where I focused on telecommunications and data networking and some of the, actually, I don't want to date myself too much, but some of the earlier models of Cisco routers and switches and things of that nature.
Don't be shy. You can anchor yourself in history. There are more and more of us with more and more gray hair. I know they can't see us, the listeners, but yeah, that's okay.
But I've seen in production AGS Plus, if that rings a bell to anybody. So.
Woo! That's Silicon Valley Computer Museum material right there.
So I started my career there, and over time I progressed as a network engineer and moved into, I guess like you consider it more like the government contracting side of things, where I used my security clearance that I had from the Air Force and worked on site at some of the three-letter agencies and DoD. And in that capacity, mainly deploying large networks and I'm securing them. And then over time, I kind of made that transition from deployment into pre-sales, and pre-sales kind of led me more into design and those types of things. And at Cisco, I worked there for 12 years. I really started to enjoy automation. So you can just kind of think of it as like kind of a combination of Python and Ansible and Terraform and Postman for REST APIs.
Sure.
I was trying to help enable my customers start their automation journey. And I really gravitated towards Ansible. So that's what brought me into Red Hat, is I wanted to focus, all of my time on being better at automating with Ansible, but also helping customers be able to adopt Ansible and to use it, in production at scale with real world scenarios.
Gotcha. And are you exclusively focused on public sector, or do you work with public sector and commercial clients?
Every once in a while, I'll help on commercial and enterprise, but I'm dedicated to NAPS. So from like a region standpoint, I cover all the various types of customers, the state and local government, DoD, the government agencies. So it's a pretty diverse and wide, set of use cases that, collectively they pretty much do and use every vendor you can think of. So it's a really good opportunity to help with networking, but networking across a lot of different vendors and use cases.
Got it. Thanks for that. Ajay, we don't let you off the hook here. It's your turn. And I know you have some interesting networking background as well, but why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. And really thank you for this opportunity to share with your audience as well. So my name is Ajay Chenampara, and I've been in the IT industry since 2000. So I'm fairly old, been doing this for a while as well. And majority of my career has been as a network operator, right? So I've never worked for a vendor until this job, right? So have a lot of battle wounds, holding a pager, running production networks, trying to scale it, trying to architect it.
I'm sorry, a pager? What's a pager?
I know, and the way I came to automation is really, I think the first time I even thought about it was I saw somebody from Facebook or Google or one of those, big hyperscalers. They were presenting at Nanog, I believe, and I was watching the recording, and they were talking about how in their network they have self-healing capabilities, right? So they obviously, I think they had their own switches and routers, right? They were not buying from any vendor. But that was a vision I completely bought into, right? So this was around the 2015 timeframe, and I was like, I want this for my network. I want this for my people, right? I want. If a link is flapping, I want something to go and shut it down automatically, right? So that's what got me started in the direction of automation. And since then, I had great opportunities. I've interacted with, it's really been a story of standing on the shoulder of giants, right? The first interactions that I had with some of the people in the network automation field were people like Peter Sprigada, who was at that time working for Ansible, right? Even before it was acquired by Red Hat, so he was a huge mentor. And when I left my job, I actually went and worked for Network to Code. At that time it was a small startup with just 7 of us. It was again a fantastic opportunity to meet some of the best minds in the industry, right? And that's where it started, right? So I was very passionate about trying to bring those same kind of capabilities for network operators everywhere, right? And since then, that led me to my present job in Red Hat. I've been with Red Hat for 6 years. Absolutely love it here. I really learned how open source works, right? How a community-driven software solution can be scaled for an enterprise, right? How open source becomes enterprise was a lesson that I really learned after joining Red Hat. And in my present role, I help agencies in the public sector and leaders in the public sector navigate really organizational challenges when it comes to adopting automation. I think honestly there are the technical challenges and organizational challenges, and technical challenges are usually a little bit more black and white than some of the organizational challenges. So
For sure.
I bring in my experience and expertise to kind of like help navigate those organizational changes within agencies.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we learned via some network automation forum activity, where if you think about people, process, and technology, the
Right.
technology is the easy part, right? Process, there's such a heritage in networking that we don't think about process or workflow very thoroughly.
Yeah.
And the people and the cultural issues are the things that we really need to get past, since we've all made our careers memorizing CLI commands in Junos and iOS and EOS and so forth, and that can be a barrier to the adoption of automation. So but that's a great warm up and understanding of your background. Tell us a little bit about Ansible, pre Red Hat. What were its origins? We know that it wasn't just a networking tool, but either of you or both of you, if you can tag team and speak about that, that's a good setup for the rest of the conversation.
I can go first, and Tony maybe can help fill the gaps that I missed there. So Ansible, right, when it was originally created, was the intention behind the solution was to help developers do operations correctly, right? So when the whole DevOps movement was taking place, and there was a whole shift left movement, the premise is that developers can do work faster if they can do operational stuff as well,
Sure.
without waiting for the operations team and without waiting for change controls and things like that. But the challenge was, how do you take that subject matter expertise of multiple years, IT operators, and then distill that? How do you make like the 10x engineer, right, who can also write code and manage your infrastructure? So Ansible is trying to solve that problem, right? So the idea was that, it's a story of it's turtles everywhere, right? It's like it's just another layer of abstraction, right? So Ansible was building that layer of abstraction where it was providing these opinionated kind of modules, really, right, where a developer could easily supply some values to variables, and that would go and make infrastructure changes. So that's truly the origin of where Ansible started. From there, I think from a network operations standpoint, I believe the first network modules were the Cisco command and config modules that showed up in Ansible. I think this is around 2017 timeframe.
Sure.
And me personally, at that time, we were looking at different solutions. We were working with TLF, and one of my compute or Unix architects. They were playing with Ansible, and they said, "Hey, you should try out this Cisco config or command module, right?" And I found that to be very intuitive as a network engineer, to be able to take the commands that I'm familiar with and not have a huge learning curve, right? To kind of like adapt that into my workflow itself. But Tony, I don't know if you had any other things to add to the Ansible story.
Well, my Ansible story, in terms of like really, focusing on it, probably goes back to about 2014. I think Ansible was around for like a couple years at that point. And
Right.
I was primarily using it to help customers onboard into OpenStack. And also, some of you may be familiar with this. Cisco used to have a managed OpenStack solution called MetaCloud.
Yep.
And behind the scenes, like the operational model of that and managing OpenStack as a service was all around Ansible automation. And then how we would deliver it to a customer and show proof of concepts and show them how to automate the APIs was driven by Ansible as well. So I learned a lot of Ansible. My focal point really was around Neutron because that was like the networking service. And I was on the team as a networking expert because they wanted a CCIE on the team. And then other people had like storage backgrounds and compute for the Nova part of it and things like that. But I was able to automate everything in OpenStack so easily, not really needing to know too much about it, the intent of what I was configuring, and like really drilling down into the lower level details. So I thought that was really cool to be able to, abstract the way that I was managing OpenStack without needing to know too much. So I took that and I moved into another role because managed OpenStack at Cisco really didn't go anywhere and it was actually sunset. So I moved back into data center. And in data center, there was so much opportunity to use Ansible to simplify the way that individuals could, from an operational perspective, glean information, from those devices, but also a lot of provisioning and building infrastructure as code using Ansible, but without needing to really become a programmer. And that was kind of the crossroads that I sort of hit because I brought automation into my role as a TSA, which was a pre-sales role, but I was like a subject matter expert around ACI, UCS, and other data center solutions at Cisco. They really wanted me to become more of a lead around automation and programmability. And the reality is that you could do a lot of these same things with Python. And Cisco typically has a Python SDK for most of the solutions that they bring to market. But you have to know, a decent amount of Python to really be able to define parameters and call those functions, from the SDK. And I really struggled trying to get customers, to a point where they could learn it, but also sustain that information. So I started exclusively using Ansible for everything. And it was really a way that I could share an approach, to make it much easier for them to onboard into the Cisco solutions. And it was a free solution because this was back, just Ansible core engine, command line. And there was a lot of things that they could do in a repetitive way, and make it so that others on the team that may not even understand Ansible could start to run the playbooks. But then you kind of hit a stopping point there. And that's where the platform's so important, because that gives you additional controls and guardrails to bring other folks into that operational model where they, typically use like self-service aspects of it, workflows, the other aspects of the automation controller that allow you to manage the automation at scale without everyone needing to know like all the underpinnings and all the tuning and all the performance tweaks that we can provide, and then make those available and then hand those off to other folks on the team. So that way, the economy of scale is so much greater there because everyone can have value, but not everyone has to dedicate as much time to becoming a subject matter expert. And then kind of walking that back to Python, like at that point in time, really everyone needed to be a subject matter expert in Python and in that targeted device, in that architecture. there really wasn't a way to meet in the middle and have, someone, provide like the coding aspects,
Sure.
and then, kind of cross that chasm over to the subject matter expert that is the command line CCIE. You kind of had to be involved on both sides of that. But with Ansible, you can live in those different paradigms and those different personas, because you can have folks that really focus on content creation, different folks that manage the platform and manage other aspects of the automation and scalability of the automation,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the architecture of the platform, and then folks that just use the automation, push a button, get a banana type of thing, and they don't have to necessarily understand how everything's working under the hood.
And now I really want to go get a banana from downstairs, but I'll hold off on that. But yeah, that whole idea of, again, with the people, process, and technology paradigm, right? So you've got a technology tool and platform that lets me think about process and lets me abstract things. Not everybody needs to be a Python programmer. Not everybody needs to know everything about the whole infrastructure. I want to tie that to the whole idea of, we all come at this from a networking perspective. Like we're very, very networking biased. But if I think about the whole idea of managing data center infrastructure, on compute, virtual machines, et cetera, how Ansible is a bit of a unifying force there, and letting folks who come from the server ops side, from the DevOps world, manage the network just like I'm already managing compute. Maybe that connected with Ansible coming into Red Hat. Am I trying to connect too many dots here, or tell me a little bit more about those connections?
No, I think you're on the right track there, Scott. The story I remember is I was at Interop. I think a few, like when it started, right? Like the first year or second year, and I remember Pete Lumbus, who was at Cumulus Network at that time.
Right.
He had this this demo that completely blew me away. Right. So he had this demo where he was doing the entire configuration lifecycle management of Cumulus switches on his laptop. So he was able to build the pipeline. And everything was centered around infrastructure as code. And the light bulb moment for me personally at that time, as as a person who was used to be proud of, I guess, what incantations can I recall about BGP or OSPF in the middle of the night, right? Was the network is just another computer. It's just a specialized computer, right? And it's basically a restricted computer. You pay you pay a lot of money for a very, very specific set of interactions you can do with this computer. And I started thinking about why are we treating it differently, right? We should be able to treat network as yet another part of that data center infrastructure, right? And for me, the key there was being able to leverage infrastructure as code. And to your point back again is that, if you're managing a data center, you should be able to not have, ideally, right? You should not be having like siloed tools that address, okay, if I need to automate my firewalls, I need a specific solution. If I need to manage my VMs, whether it's Windows or Linux, I need another solution. If it's my hypervisors, yet another solution. And networks, depending on the vendor, again, what solutions you have. And then you tie this all together with some ITSM solution as well, right? So being able to kind of look at, from an operational standpoint, the way I recommend people to think about automation strategy, right? Even from a data center perspective, would be look at your ITSM and look at the tickets, right? And see in the last quarter, last month, whatever, right? Some period, if there are any patterns that emerge, right? And oftentimes people find that there are patterns that emerge. They'll be like, we're just adding and removing VLANs, right? Or we're changing load balancer rules, or we're adding and removing firewall rules, right? So those things, right, are things that you can automate, and you can tie those together across your infrastructure space. You don't need special tools for each of those pieces, right? Being able to use a single tool that everybody can kind of use while having having tenancy restrictions across these silos, in my opinion, is a key component for having a successful automation implementation.
But if I look at those trends, it might actually impact how I do my job, Ajay. It might even take away pieces of my job. So yeah, no, I'm not really interested in looking at trends in the ticketing system, right? And I'm being snarky here because I think for networkers in particular, this is a cultural issue that it's been hard for a lot of us to get around. So yeah, stated very well. Thank you.
No, absolutely, and I can tell you, I went through this journey myself, right? And and I made a lot of mistakes, right? So I'm going to share my mistakes so people can learn from it as well, right? So when we were looking at automation, like I said, inspired by that story there from Facebook or Google, I don't remember which organization it was that presented that session. We went after, we wanted to solve something similar, right? We wanted like a big story. At this time I was working at GE, and GE had this concept of building the next Amazon, right? So they wanted to build AWS for Internet of Things. It was called industrial Internet of Things, right? We were going to build our own cloud. So one of the solutions from an automation perspective we built was using TLF. At that time, we built a solution that allowed any company that wanted to connect to our cloud, right? We were able to provide an API. They would put in their BGP information, and it would build configurations for both sides, and connections would be up. We presented it. It was well received internally. It was like a proof of concept kind of thing that we built to kind of like present the idea. But ultimately, that was not as relevant as I learned. That was not as relevant a use case as being able to solve things like, if I'm patching my servers, I need to take if I have like a server farm that is fronting some website, right? I want to be able to cycle through the servers, patch them individually, and put them back into the load balancer, and that requires a lot of manual changes, and it requires an entire change control window, usually on a weekend, burning overtime, right? All those things. When you solve those from an automation standpoint, that is a fairly simple and easy one to solve, and doesn't take that much effort, and you can do it repeatedly and has a lot more value. A use case like that had a lot more impact than solving a big, sexy orchestration type
right
use case.
Tony, anything you want to add there? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, in terms of use cases?
Use cases and the whole idea of what patterns have you observed that like this is low hanging fruit for automation?
Yeah, so I think the low hanging fruit are those opportunistic types of things that you have to do anyway, and people struggle with. And I guess like given the current climate of change with trying to onboard like new vendors, and in some cases maybe force reduction in staff, and additional complexities of like consolidations and migrations and things of that nature. So with that being said, there's a lot of tools that typically these teams have used or potentially have used for a long time. So I don't want to like name drop too many things or poo poo on any vendors, but there's a lot of vendors out there that have done a good job for a long time, but the paradigm is shifting. So things that were more SNMP centric from a management perspective and discovery, and in some cases like very simple automations, kind of they work in the extent of the use cases that they support, but they don't offer a lot of flexibility into what like Ajay was alluding to and yourself, where we're like starting to expand, from the network to other IT domains. So in like a multi-domain environment, if you really want to orchestrate, be successful with orchestrating automation, into those other architectures and domains, then you really need a platform that leverages infrastructure as code, because all of them would be considered, a stovepipe in terms of how you're managing like that source of truth for their configurations. So if something lives in like an appliance or, a network management tool in a database, and it only has, configuration state for that particular campus network, or something to do, an older tool with storage or anything along those lines. It's really hard to be able to stitch those together, in a way that you can orchestrate a workflow without having infrastructure as code paradigm. So, like, how do you introduce these paradigms? And
Sure.
to the network teams, that could be a bit of a challenge, mainly from the way that they typically work. So, a lot of times you'll run into network shops that are primarily Windows desktops. So, all their
Mhm.
tooling is Windows.
Sure.
And they're typically using PuTTY or Secure CRT, or some tool, SSH driven tool, and they
Right.
overlay access devices and create templates and paste configurations and troubleshoot in that paradigm. But in terms of like moving into like infrastructure as code, then there's different tooling. So
Sure.
a lot of times that is, there's a bit of a barrier to entry for those teams. So there's the workstation aspect and the way that they typically interact with the current devices, as well as other capabilities that are paramount into moving to what I would consider more net DevOps than DevOps, since we're talking networking, but then touching, outside of network, would be like Git repositories are foundational to being able to, to leverage source control as you're creating configurations in the code, which in the world of Ansible are the playbooks and Jinja2 templates
Right.
and things of that nature, and being able to understand source control in branches, right? Because typically we're not creating content to go push it directly into production and see what happens, right? We want to
Right.
build test dev environments for configuration. We want staging environments that closely represent production with hardware and software, at least
Right.
to the extent that from a configuration standpoint, it's almost, on parity. Perhaps throughput and speeds and feeds and things like that in the scope of how many devices you have are certainly going to be, order of magnitude smaller there. And then
Right.
ultimately moving into production. So that's that whole notion of a CI/CD pipeline being delivered into net DevOps. So there's a whole lot of learning around just Git repositories up front. And then moving into more of a Linux type of environment to work closely around like all of the other mechanisms and components that are the underpinnings of Ansible and many of the other tools that we would introduce into those pipelines. So
Yep.
kind of taking that step into that environment. So having said that, and back to like the use case standpoint, once you kind of get them down the road to a certain point with those foundational pieces, then you can look at those opportunistic use cases, things like backups, updates
Right.
of devices, certificate rotations, just gleaning, the configuration state or compliance information from these devices, or what we sometimes call dynamic documentation. All those things are very simple to orchestrate in automation across many different types of devices, even outside of network devices, using common paradigms that we would normally use in Ansible, and
Mhm.
creating workflows around that and schedules, to run them at certain times of the day and collect all that information. You just have to get through that, that initial skill gap to be able to get to a point where you can, leverage Ansible and most of the code or the playbooks that you need to run a lot of those foundational, beginner use cases that are opportunistic is actually not completely out of the box, because you always have to tweak things. But our
Sure.
validated content, you can think of those as packages that make it very rapid and easy to deliver that automation with not really needing to know too much about Ansible to get started. But certainly, it wouldn't I wouldn't consider it like a stopping point. Like the goal should be to take validated content and then work on top of that, to like layer complexity on top of that. But a lot of those starter use cases are covered in the validated content, and it's very easy to provide automation around those. Now, in the network space, use cases can become very complex very quickly. And a
Sure.
lot of times I'm approached with, hey, can you automate this particular use case? Show us a custom demo. Sure, I can. Okay, now add this and that. And now we want, all these other components together. That's okay from like a product standpoint. I can demonstrate that, we can actually build that and demonstrate that it works in a proof of concept. But
Sure.
you certainly need to build that skill set and be able to understand that, in that whole transfer over to the customer, there's a lot of foundational, aspects of the platform that they need to learn. But the good news is that there's a lot of training around getting folks to that point very quickly and rapidly.
Right.
Organized training, like our Red Hat online training. And it's just a skip. It's a step that you certainly wouldn't want to skip. So you kind of bring them along. And then use cases that, the lower complexity, high value, because it's things that are very repetitive and warrant a lot of man hours, like upgrades as an example. And then start to build, layered provisioning types of, more complex automation use cases on top of that. So like building things like layer 3 VPN, MPLS, and those types of configurations, or VXLAN, those I wouldn't start with, but I would certainly not shy away from them, because those are certainly use cases that we can support, but we wouldn't want to, throw a customer directly in there, because it can work, but it's, we want to give them a little bit easier starting point, if that makes sense.
And the scenarios that are more complex kind of depend on the application area. Like, so, for data center operators, they might be much more fluent with EVPN, VXLAN, and so forth. But starting with the more complex use cases is a guaranteed recipe for disaster, right? Here's how to prevent anybody from being interested in automation in your network ever again, by trying to tackle the hardest use cases first.
Yeah.
You have a comment, Ajay? I see that brewing.
No, I was just going to say that I think automation, is foundationally not a turnkey solution, right? It's not a box you can put in your data center, turn it on, and make it work. It's very nuanced, right? Everybody's data center or network is a snowflake. There are things that they know about managing it, only that they know, right? Like, I can give you an example myself. When we had mergers and acquisitions, we would do VLAN layer 2 translations between their data center and our data center, because we have the same VLAN numbers, right?
Yep.
So when there's a spanning tree incident, there are certain places that we know we need to go and check first, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're building automation to do things like intelligent triage, or like, I like to think of it as automation being an Iron Man suit for the operator, right? So
you beat me to it. Yep.
Do all these show commands that I would have gone and done myself, right? But there's a certain order, right? And it because you've been managing that data center on network for years.
Yeah.
There are certain places that you go and check for. So automation is definitely not turnkey. It requires that subject matter expertise. So back to your point earlier when you were talking about, I may not want to do some of these things from an automation perspective because it'll replace me. I don't think that is very factual. There might be cases, right, where if there's not other value that the person is adding, and automation could take away their job. But for the most part, in my experience, what I've seen is usually once automation comes into play, the champions usually run with it, right? So they learn to kind of like build on top of it and see how they can offer more and more services to their constituents, to their customers, now that they have the bandwidth to be able to tackle some of this stuff.
So let's make sure we spend some time talking about like public sector issues here.
Right.
So let's translate some of the things we've been talking about into this very big lumped all together bucket called public sector. And like, I'll be the first person to say it's almost not fair to treat it as a single thing, right? I mean, we're talking about U.S. federal government, and even that's not monolithic, right? You have civilian agencies, you have DoD agencies, you have intel agencies, and even within those three buckets, they don't all operate the same way. You've got state governments. There's at least 50 of them, or 51 if we're counting the District of Columbia. And, then local counties, municipalities, school districts within a municipality and so forth. So there's a huge range of different types of users across all this. I'll leave it to you two to say where you want to focus on the rest of this conversation. But what are some of the top issues that you run into pick your favorite public sector entity to pick on that you don't typically run into in a commercial or enterprise environment?
Okay, I'll take a first stab at it, Tony. One thing right? Even though, like you said, Scott, there's like a range of agencies, and depending on agencies, right, it's hard to group them together. But if you look at recent CIO surveys, both at the federal level and at the state level, right? Among the top 5 things that come up as priorities at that level is automation, right? In
Sure.
fact, I think the state CIO survey listed that CIOs should become experts in automation, and we're
And
actually
you mean across all IT domains? You're
correct.
not just talking about network automation here.
That's right, exactly,
Yep.
right. And um, we're seeing that actually being reflected in some of the job titles now, right? So
Interesting.
there are job titles showing up as director of automation, for instance, right?
Okay.
And to me, what that's telling me is that automation is not new, right? Automation existed since computers. Computers exist for automating things, right?
Right.
Uh, but when you look at the IT infrastructure domain, IT automation has never been a first class citizen until now, right? It's been people do things, right? We've all written scripts, we've all written TCL and expect and Perl scripts most likely
Sure. Yep.
before the modern tools, right? To kind of like make our jobs easier. But now what's happening is, automation is being recognized as a requirement for agencies to deliver their mission, right? Whether it's a warfighting mission, right, or whether it's supporting, renewing your licenses at the DMV, right? So huge extremes of use cases, but the idea is that in order to be able to support a better user experience from a citizen standpoint, right, agencies have to adopt automation and it's become a critical part of how they deliver to their mission. Now, with that theme established, however, I think uh, public sector agencies face, I think, similar challenges that large organizations typically tend to face, right? Namely, silos, right? Having multiple silos, and a lot of legacy, technical debt is another huge
Sure.
challenge. A lot of legacy applications, a lot of legacy infrastructure, and usually some of those budget challenges as well, right? So they cannot sometimes budget years in advance. They have to go by what the government allows from a budgetary standpoint, and that is usually time restricted and so on, right? So that's some of the challenges. Adoption challenges exist. I think that's across the board in general, though not that may not be just specific to public sector, but definitely does exist in public sector. And personally, also, I face cultural challenges. Right, there is sometimes resistance to automation. There is fear of automation, thinking that automation is going to take my job away. So, where I've seen agencies kind of being successful in navigating some of these challenges are when they have visionary leaders, they have strong leadership who believe in bringing in mission critical solutions to support these challenges. Yeah, so I don't know, Tony, if you wanted to add to that.
I would say too, Tony, with your DoD background and some of the work that you do, obviously without revealing stuff you're not supposed to talk about, like you have even more stringent requirements that I think constrain some of the things you can probably do in different customer environments.
Yeah, I guess there's some challenges that are ubiquitous across DoD and different agencies that kind of fall under some of the same requirements. And if you look at it from like the lens that Ajay's talking about, a lot of those are at a high level were driven by executive orders. And then you've got the OPM OMB. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
Office of Personnel Management, Office of Management of the Budget, where
Mm-hmm.
they enforce a lot of those directives.
Right.
So a lot of those are broad and high level. And I guess it depends, like politically, which way you're looking at them. They change, over
Sure.
different administrations. But typically, as they funnel down, into these agencies, most of the agencies are under similar guidelines around security, network security, compliance. Those types of capabilities that automation brings forth to make it a lot easier. And
Mm-hmm.
from a benefits perspective, some of the metrics that they typically measure us by are around improved velocity to deliver services. And in order to go faster, you need to reduce risk as well. So
Mhm.
it's kind of an easy win in automation because regardless the type of customer out of the gate, you're going to reduce human error. It
Sure.
doesn't really matter what the use case is. That's an easy, low lying fruit type of thing that everyone
Right.
notices right off the bat. But where I think we really hit the mark is around operational efficiencies,
Yep.
because a lot of times as you measure like man hours and
Mhm.
specific compliance, since that's such a big one in the DoD space,
Sure.
most of our customers see like an 80% reduction in the amount of time that's spent in compliance because we're able to touch so many devices so quickly and to do these compliance checks and then to provide a list of the information that's out of compliance and to give them the ability that typically they don't do in like an automated remediation. So there's typically change control
Mhm.
processes as well, but it makes it a lot easier for them to request the downtime and then to address more remediation in a smaller window. So less
Right.
downtime, go faster, and that's a big win for just generically across these DoD types of customers. Now,
Sure.
some of the challenges that they have early on, like that's kind of like not really the end state, but that's kind of like the big first step into seeing the benefits of automation is
Mhm.
how do they get there? So to kind of bootstrap this environment and to give like the initial capabilities and enablement to kind of get up and running, that's where they have very specific challenges that we typically have to work through. One of those is just the nature of connecting to devices. So if you're familiar with SSH and just how that
Right.
works generically, typically we're dealing with key exchange and ciphers.
Mhm.
So it's a matter of, okay, what what vendor, what model, what software are you running, and what keys and ciphers does it support? And you'd be surprised the amount of legacy gear that's out there in some of these environments. And so I can't get into like particulars around
Sure.
that and where,
Yep.
but like you'll run into those types of things, which are a challenge because as we move forward, we're working, and I mentioned we're not in a Microsoft environment, we're in a Linux environment. So when you look at the versions of RHEL that we're running, from the compute standpoint, certain keys and ciphers aren't supported as newer releases of the RHEL itself and Linux. And then trying to kind of like backport what you can make work to connect to some of these legacy devices, that's an issue. So we have to kind of work out, okay, what are you running? What ciphers can we use that's available on Linux? And not to get too deep in the weeds on AAP, but under the hood with the automation platform, we're running this execution environment, which is a container that the universal base image is RHEL. So it
Right.
depends on what version RHEL and how you set up, the mode in which you want to run encryption on that. So if you look at the crypto policies, we can set those in different ways. And then sometimes we have to set them differently because they have older devices, they have newer devices, they have multiple vendors. So we have to kind of work all that out. So it's not like an easy button to just connect devices to Ansible.
Sure.
You're getting up and running, but you would run into the same issue if you're using, other Python ways. So
Right.
with NetMiko and like all those other kind of tools, you have to align like
Mhm.
what ciphers work depending on the devices. So that's typically the first challenge is we have to really work with them to understand what are the various devices, what versions of software you're running. And then we may have execution environments that are configured a certain way to support legacy and also
Mhm.
to support libSSH, which is the default now. But then moving forward, if a device is in FIPS mode, then there's certain ciphers that we have to make available on the RHEL side and to take that EE and configure it in FIPS mode as well. So that becomes, that's a pattern, right? And it just depends on the customer and what they need configured. The other thing I already talked about, so learning about Git repositories
Yeah,
and
the console part of it, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
so a
And
lot of
that's going to drive whether I can use a cloud-based service versus something that I have to be able to run locally, right? From a source code control system.
That's
So,
that's actually a good point you bring up, Scott, because with agencies, and I didn't touch upon this as when you said what challenges agencies see, right? One of the one of the things that we almost exclusively see in public sector is the fact that almost like many of these federal and DoD type entities, the solution has to be disconnected. right? It has to be completely disconnected. Sometimes it has to be air gapped. Sometimes these are solutions running on vehicles or running on submarines or ships, right? So the solution has to be flexible enough to handle planetary scale and security, while at the same time could also be carried, in a portable unit on a Humvee potentially.
Right. Yep. Sorry, I interrupted you, Tony. You were in the flow
no
of something there. Yeah.
Yeah. So in addition to first, okay, how do we connect all these different various devices? And then the next thing is how do you want to manage these devices? What is the source of your inventory?
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where there's so many, various tools out there that become potential sources for a dynamic inventory, because we typically want a dynamic inventory if there's change in the environment. It doesn't make sense to manage a large monolithic static inventory source. So we'll work through that, what makes sense. Sometimes there's, various tools, or, depending on the IPAM that they're using, that could be a good source. Single source of truth types of tools like a netbox can be a good source for the inventory. Your ITSM tool, really whatever has the broadest view of the network devices and is the one that they typically would update first, is the one that we would want to use for the inventory source. And then I guess the third point of that is just single source of truth methodology as well. With infrastructure as code, we kind of imply that normally the starting point there is that the configurations are managed in a Git repository, so more around a GitOps paradigm. But in the network space, we're seeing, more of a shift towards a netbox type of source of truth that has a database. And because we have a collection to interact with that database, we can query the configuration context, configuration templates, and other configuration state that's a part of the netbox type of solution. Right. And then we can compare that before making a change, so that we can control any configuration drift that may have happened out of band prior to making a change with automation, and also to enforce policy if it's an automation driven use case. Because really, to be successful with automation, you have to have a commitment that whatever you're going to automate, that is the primary, and in some cases the only way that you're going to configure that particular use case on a set of devices. But there's always those circumstances where there's troubleshooting, or if someone just goes around that particular policy and goes out of band and make changes, you need to be able to detect those and understand, is the policy to overwrite them, or is it appropriate to ingest that change and then update your source of truth? So if that were if that were a repository, then that is, one particular option for maintaining a branch that is the main branch for production, if you make a change in production. Or it could be a tool like a netbox or an Autobot, or something like that, where that needs to be updated from Ansible in that particular situation as well.
I think one of the other things you're indirectly pointing out is the need for really good integrations between different pieces of tooling. You've referred to multiple source of truth vendors. There are people writing their own Python scripts. There's other pieces of tooling here, and there isn't one dominant vendor that does it all, right? You have to have well-documented, understandable APIs and know how to stitch things together. That's been really fascinating for me as over the last few years in particular, as we kind of seen this ecosystem really mature for networking.
And that was a clear gap. So I mentioned that I was using Ansible when I was at Cisco, helping customers, onboarding them into programmability. Right. But at that time, we were running playbooks individually, and it was really hard to integrate into those other services outside of what you're just running from either your laptop or from a jump host. With Ansible, it gives you a platform that has those integrations into all of those other third-party tools. Not to say that Ansible doesn't come, it's a batteries included up to a certain extent with credential management and those types of things. But if you don't want to use
batteries to run Ansible,
if you don't want to use local capabilities, you can extend it to a HashiCorp Vault or a CyberArk, for credentials, and then any ITSM that you want to use, any IPAM, stitches it together, like you said, in a workflow. But you're not limited to any of the integration in itself, or a prescriptive way that we say, that you must use certain tools to be supported by Ansible. It's completely open, and you can do whatever you want in that regard. But you're able to, stitch together all those capabilities to provide really automation plus management plus IPAM plus ITSM plus security. So it becomes a portion of that overall construct, but it doesn't prevent you or provide any limitation to any of the other tools that you want to run in that particular workflow.
Got it.
I
Ajay,
was,
you had, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I was going to say that nobody has a greenfield, right?
Right.
Everybody's starting with already some incumbent solutions that's already there. There's already investments from a tooling standpoint, and for an automation solution or an automation strategy to really work, it cannot be a solution that tries to replaces all these investments that are already there. It has to work, and it has to have the possibility of integrations with all these solutions, right? And I think that's one place that Ansible truly shines, is to be able to kind of like Tony referred to, the batteries included approach of being able to integrate with all these different vendors and solutions that are out there.
There's so much we could take from this conversation, and we are going to have to bring this to a close shortly. But I want to touch on one of the things that I think you both hinted at earlier. The gains in efficiency, taking that low-hanging fruit, not going after the most complex scenarios, but being able to really show ROI quickly, and not just show ROI, but actually improve the operations environment. If I overlay that on the current very interesting government and U.S. government environment we have right now. Again, I don't want to make this a political episode, but it's spring 2025 as we record this, and if you haven't heard, there's this interesting organization called DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, that's really focused on driving efficiency, perhaps in some good ways, perhaps in some suboptimal ways.
Yeah.
What messages do you bring to your federal customers to say, look, I can help you get through this, where if you can do these things, you can gain efficiency, not just to meet some organization's demands, but to really, help the operations environment and help us as taxpayers?
Yeah. No, let me take that, right? So I think, this is something that every vendor is probably going to have a pitch for, saying that, hey, my AI solution, my automation solution, my software solution is what's going to help you, with this particular challenge. But what I'm seeing is, these changes are having, a human impact on the agencies, while at the same time leaders are trying to support their people and trying to solve the problem at the same time, right?
Sure.
So my approach has been in these conversations around three things that can help make these kind of decisions. One is, whatever you buy, whatever solution you end up selecting to kind of like help with this challenge, and I believe that at this point they will need a technology solution to help with this challenge, right? To kind of like offset some of the human labor that's being lost. One of the key consideration has to be minimal adoption friction, right? So to if you're buying a solution, and now if you need to hire a new skill set that can manage the solution, to me that is a loss, right? So being able to use your existing subject matter experts and embrace a solution that has a low learning curve is going to be critical. The second thing that I recommend, or I kind of like advise decision makers on, is in terms of tool rationalization, right? So if you're trying to show cost efficiencies, one way you can do it is to rationalize your tools, right? So if you're having a separate solution for managing your Windows machines, another for your Linux machines, yet another for your network devices, right? If you're able to pick a solution that has the maximum integrations, has scalability, has a security that can deliver 80 to 90% or even 100% of the use cases you're using point tools for, you want to think about that solution to kind of like help you with your challenges. And the final one I would say is that when you think about automation, sometimes the first response is, I'll build my own, right? I'll write my scripts.
Right.
Ansible is open source. I can just build a front end for it or whatever, right? There, and this is where I think another thing should be super important to remember is ensuring that there is a secure software supply chain, even for your automation solutions, has to be key, right? I was a network engineer. I wrote a lot of Python code, and I started by just Googling and learning and writing. I wrote code in Python. I wrote code in Perl. I wrote code in Expect. But
Sure.
I'm not a software trained engineer, right? I'm a network trained engineer, and my code, I doubt, was not secure. I don't know what libraries I were downloading from the internet, right? I don't know if these libraries have been compromised or not,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
I'm running these out of my laptop. While that might, like as a network engineer, I think that spirit is great. You want to learn, right? But not in your enterprise network. Maybe in a isolated lab, it might make sense. So the third criteria I would say is that whatever solution you're choosing should be secure and scalable, right? So to be and when I mean secure and scalable, I also mean that if you're writing extensions, like Tony said, right, Ansible is extensible. The solution should have mechanisms where you can inject security into those things that you write yourself, right? So if you're writing your own augmentations, right, and Ansible allows you to build those abstractions,
Sure.
you want to have a way to ensure you can sign it, right, and you can secure it, and make sure that only signed and secure content can be executed against your production machines, right?
Yep.
So those would be
Yep.
the three things that I would recommend, especially in this scenario, if people are looking at solutions, right? Think in terms of these as decision criteria when you make your decisions on what that solution should look like.
That's great. Great laying out of really basic things for people to be able to think about. And there's a whole other conversation here on the change in the adoption of open source by the
Yeah.
government. Like over the course of my career, I came to DC in 1991, and the first projects I worked on were software development practices for both EPA and NASA. And, the waterfall model, closed system development, and how that's changed completely, and how we better understand the security benefits of open source software and the transparency, allowing vulnerabilities and issues to be found much more quickly. But that's going to be a topic for another day. So, Tony, was there anything you wanted to add on Ajay's comments there? Because I'll move to the fun questions at the end of the episode once I give you one last chance for substantive comment.
Well, probably just to respond to the workforce optimization. If you really look into it, and probably a couple of things that caught my eye are just things around just reducing the amount of contractors and those, just the head count.
Right.
And so that just kind of lends itself. It's starting to just reading that part, it starts to lend itself to automation. It does mention that tasks need to be considered for automation. That's actually in that mandate. And the other thing is reducing the amount of regional offices, which to me means consolidations, migrations, cutovers. So those are certainly tactical things that we can help, using the Ansible automation platform to make it easier for folks to be able to, implement that change, using our tooling and our guardrails and reducing mistakes and just all the things that we've already mentioned. It just kind of falls right into our wheelhouse.
Right. No, all makes sense. I know you guys could share a lot more wisdom on this stuff. We're just time constrained, so we'll wrap this down. But to end on a fun note, we have two questions, and since there's two of you, I'm gonna make a game time call here. I'm gonna give Tony one of the questions, and Ajay will end with you. So, Tony, the question for you is: when you did maintenance windows, when you needed support that 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. cutover window, were you a music on the maintenance window kind of guy? And if you were, what would be your choice music for maintenance window coverage?
For me to stay awake, it'd probably be more death metal types of stuff, Slayer,
There you go.
Like that. get the juices flowing before I go in there and hit that command line.
No, but understood that you're not alone in that choice, that genre, right? A lot of people, it's audio caffeine, right? So very good. Ajay, you get the funnest one, and I think you're ready for this. But when you've done what we've done for as long as we have, and because Tony, supported DoD, there's no way I was going to ask him this question, but you don't get away with this. Now's your chance to own up to any outage you may have caused over time. And if you can't do that, you can talk to a really interesting outage that you observed that you may or may not have had any role in.
Does packet pushers have a opportunity for TN oops? I can
You heard it here first, folks. TN oops. I'm going to use that. So what's your TN oops story?
I remember vividly my first large outage. This was I think my second year into the job. I was manning a NOC, and it was the night shift, and it was my job to add a new ACE entry into an ACL on a Cisco router. This was over a PPP over E DSL connection in some remote site, and I don't know if you remember this, but for some of these devices, in order to insert an ACE, you had to kind of copy the entire access list, add this new thing, go there and delete it, and then re-add this entire thing. So we had a blacklist type access list. So the end of it was IP any, allowing IP any, right? And all the denies in front of it. And so when I applied this, when I copied and pasted this, I guess the last line did not get pasted over the terminal. I did not know. I left my I left my shift. I went home and I turned off my pager, and next day I got a call as soon as I went to work, and this was before cell phones, right? So I didn't have a cell phone or anything, right? So I went into work, and my boss was like, I need to have a conversation with you. You took down an entire site. So I have too many stories. I'm going to share two more real quick ones though, right?
Real quick, sure.
Because these are fun ones. We had, and this is not caused by me. This was we had
sure, Ajay.
No, this is funny one too. We had a giant outage, and when we did the root cause analysis, we found that our Cisco CSS devices had rebooted. So we opened attack with Cisco, and long story short, apparently the reason that these devices rebooted was because of a solar flare. So a bit flipped. To me, to this day, that's still the most mind-boggling outage that I've had. How do you troubleshoot something like that? When a solar flare causes a bit to flip on a CSS device. And the final one I'll share was, this is related to automation, and therefore I think makes it kind of like a good conclusion to this conversation. Somebody plugged in a Windows server into our data center, and it had a virtual switch on the Windows server. So BPDU guard was not enabled on that access layer switch onto which this server was connected. We had a meltdown.
Right.
And it became my job to audit BPDU guard across all our data centers across the world. So I ended up writing a Perl script that actually got the job done for one data center. And then I produced my report, my CSV file, and 3 months later, I was told to go and audit another data center. So I looked up my Perl script. I thought I'll read on it there, through some errors, and I'm looking at this code, and I don't know who wrote it anymore.
Right.
To me, that really brings in the value of using abstractions for automation, right? So when you have outages like this, and you're trying to build automations for it. Of course, you if you're a smart person, you're going to be able to write code to kind of make your job easier. But being able to maintain it and sustain it over a long period of time is where you really want to have some vendor come and handle that headache for you. So I'll stop with that.
Automated generation of documentation is a real use case,
right?
Because nobody wants to document their code, and even if they do, will you understand it 6 months, 12 months down the road? Very
Precisely.
good. It was a pleasure to have you both here. I highly recommend to follow up with Tony and Ajay for any listeners. You know your customers well, you know your tooling well. Where would you like to send folks to learn more, to contact you? Ajay, do you have any place you want to send people to?
Yeah, so we have actually, just for Packet Pushers audience, we have a special, time limited thing going on right now. So we have if you go to this URL, and I'll spell it out, might be easier. It's red.ht, and hopefully this will be in the show notes and all that.
It
Right?
will. Yep.
So it's like Red Hat without the A in the hat. So it's red.ht/Packet Pushers. You'll be entered into a raffle, and you'll get some swag. I hear it's an Ansible shirt and a hoodie. But more importantly, on that website, I've kind of like collected a bunch of our ebooks that are available for people to get started with Ansible automation, for network engineers on how to use Ansible for network automation, some use cases that they can follow along. And if you need to build a business case for bringing in Ansible, right, there are some resources in there for you as well. So
perfect. Anything else for, like, are you on LinkedIn? Do you want people to reach you there?
Yeah. I used to be active on all the platforms, GitHub and Twitter and everything, but these days I'm mostly just on LinkedIn. So my handle on LinkedIn is termlen0, just like you would type in a router. So yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn at termlen0.
Very good. Tony, how about you?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So on LinkedIn, mine is Dubiel Coding. If you search that, it'll go to my profile. And once a month, I run an online free meetup group for Ansible for networking. So if
cool.
anyone's interested in more hands-on types of stuff, where we go through like demos, or every once in a while have like hands-on workshops where people are allocated like pods and they go through and drive themselves. You can check that out it's on the regular meetups site, the www.meetup.com/Ansible for networking, but the 4 is the digit 4. So Ansible for networking. And it's free. It'll show past events. So there's links to like the past videos, and also any GitHub repositories with code, or any slides and that type of thing is archived in the past events.
That's good to know. I think I'll probably check that out, and maybe you'll see me in a future session. That's awesome. Well, look, thank you both very much. Pleasure to have you guys here today. I'm sure we can find time to do more of this again on some other more specific topics. And to everyone else who tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in to Total Network Operations. This is a reminder that TNOps is a growing project, and we'd love your feedback. If you know someone, or you are someone with important things to say about NetOps, automation, related topics, please contact us. These episodes provide a channel to promote best practices and big ideas from Red Hat and from many other organizations. Spread the word. Drop me a DM on LinkedIn, or send us follow-up at packetpushers.net/follow-up. We will see you next time on TNOps, Total Network Operations.
Thank you for trusting us with your audience, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Scott.